Hello there. In this video lesson we're going to show you how you can use one of the many design elements that are built into Fluid Designer for 3D printing so that you can create this tangentoidal crown curve bracelet as shown on the screen there. So if you start up Fluid Designer, first thing to do is to go to the Bracelets folder, and we're looking for the tangentoidal crown object. Now many of these objects that are on the screen here as we're scrolling down can be used in the same way as the object that we're going to show you. So the skills that you learn in producing this particular bracelet can be used for creating many of different types of bracelet. So this is the object that we're looking for in this lesson. It's a tangentoidal crown curve bracelet. So if we just drag and drop that onto the workspace, and I'll just switch on the screencast key, so any key presses I make should be displayed down here. And if I just move this panel down slightly, you can see a little bit more. So we've got this tangentoidal crown curve object, and there's an inner diameter at the moment which is actually set at 65 millimeters. So I'm just holding down the center mouse button and just rocking the object there so you can see what we've got on the screen. If we select the tangentoidal crown curve object there, you'll see that there are a number of things set up. For example, there's a cross-section diameter of 1.5 millimeters. Now what you will find with these objects, this is usually the minimum size that you would want to use if you wanted to print this particular file. We have tested these, and if we go below this size you may find it won't be 3D printable. Not always the case, but quite often. But the cross-section can be changed to something else. So I could do it as a square cross-section, for example. I mean, this is a rounded cross-section at the moment. We could do a square cross-section of 1.5 by 1.5, but you can see that well, maybe you like it, but for me the appearance of that doesn't look too good. The rounded cross-section looks a lot better. So that's one, one reason that there are these choices here. That looks a lot nicer. So that's in the curve data information. You can change the thickness of the object. Here we can change the bracelet size. So at the moment the default size is 65 millimeters. So you could switch on a different size here, 55 millimeters for example, as being the inner diameter, so that object. So what you'd have to do is to click on the bracelet itself and change the bracelet size from inner diameter. Inner diameter is this object here, that's the default circle. Okay, that's this larger circle here. If we change this down to the other object which we've just put in view, 55 millimeters, you'll see that the size of the bracelet changes. Well, I'm going to actually stick with the inner diameter, the default size, and just leave it at 65 millimeters for the moment. And I'm just going to switch off the view of the 55 millimeter circle there, and the selection of it. The eye is the view, the arrow is to select it, to click on it. Okay, so you could set the bracelet size, but we'll leave it. But we've got a couple of other things here. Now these two, the set the columns and the set the rows, these are in fact modifiers. They're called array modifiers. And we use array modifiers to make multiple copies of one object. So if you can see here, as I reduce the count down, you'll see the number of columns of this object is repeated around the bracelet. So that's a second column, a third column, a fourth column of the same object. Now if I just restrict it to 2 columns at the moment, there's also a value here that's set 0.7. That's the offset. Well, if we increase that to 1, you'll see that the objects, well, they're actually just touching there, but that actually won't 3D print. That's effectively a gap. The material overlap there will be so thin that it wouldn't 3D print. So you do need some overlap. Now as you change the overlap, as you change the relative offset, you actually change the pattern that you get. Now there is a bit of a trade-off with this, because sometimes when you've got very many of these objects overlapping, the final object may not be 3D printable, so you may find you have to come back and change it. And that's particularly true if you set the rows as well. Let me just set the count down to 1. The rows, if I set the rows down to 1, you see I go back when both of these are 1. This is the original default object. This is the original tangentoidal curve, crown curve, that our bracelet is made up of. So we're just making multiple copies of this. Now the more copies we make of it, the more overlaps that we have, the more complicated the object becomes. Sometimes you may have problems with printing, but generally you find that with these objects they do print. But what you can't do is to change it to something like that, whereby they are not, well, they're barely touching there, but there's not enough metal, not enough material there for it to be 3D printed. So you do need the relative offset to be less than 1, generally speaking. Okay, so I'm going to set it back as a count of 2, which is what it was started off as. And let's just complete the bracelet now. And if we go right round, now you've got to be careful when you get to this point here as to what the overlap looks like. If we go back to the opening screenshot, you can see that there's the tangentoidal crown. That's the 3D printed one that we've produced, and it's got 1, 2, 3. I think that might actually have, yeah, it's actually got 3 rows. So 3 rows did work for this bracelet here when we uploaded it to be checked at Shapeways. And so you could do 3 rows, but I'll stick back down to 2 at the moment. Now you could 3D print that object, that bracelet, with a slight gap there, or you could increase the count more. Now what you've got to be careful of when you get to this point is that the overlap, what does the overlap appearance look like? Well, you can probably see there that you've got a different pattern in this part of the bracelet compared with the other parts. Yeah, this part of the bracelet here doesn't quite look like anywhere else. Now you can play around with these figures here. You could switch that to 0.8. Oh yeah, and look, that's actually just pretty much solved the problem straight away if I change it to 0.8. Now the values that are here, you know, are going to vary from every single model that you produce as to what looks right and what doesn't. But if you want to stick to 0.7, you're going to have to take into account that you've got this different appearance here. Now you could click in the box and try 0.76, say, and see what effect that has, and you can see that that produces a more regular appearance at 0.76. So you don't have to just click on the ends here and go up in increments of 0.1. You can actually type values in and adjust it until you get a pattern that you're truly happy with. Now once you've got a pattern that you're happy with, remember in Fluid Designer for 3D printing, we don't save these files, we export them. We export them as printable file formats, and so you go to File, Export, export it as a wavefront object, and I usually do it to the desktop, and so I'm just going to call that, I'm going to call it 001 actually. So it's a tangentoidal crown curve bracelet, 65mm. I'm going to call it 001 and export that. Now it'll take a little bit of time to do that because there's a lot of copies of that same basic pattern there. We've got I think 21 or 22 columns and 2 rows, so it's quite a bit of computing processing's got to go on before it will actually save this object. And then of course what you must do is go to Netfab Basic and run it through Netfab Basic to just tidy the object up and make it fully 3D printable. So there's the finished bracelet. Now, what else could we do with this? Well, if I just take the count back down to 1 there, and if I just click in that box and type 1 to take the count back down, an alternative thing that we can do with this is if we wanted to reduce the amount of metal in our bracelet and change the appearance of it, what we could do is if we reduce this down to the original curve, if I press the tab key on the keyboard, and then if I just go to view and view it from the front and just just zoom in a little bit, and I'll just move this panel back. Now all the control points are currently highlighted there. If I press A on the keyboard, that'll deselect all the control points. A again will reselect them all. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually stretch this object out in the X direction. And we can do that by pressing S on the keyboard for scale. And you'll see up in the, if you look at the top of the screen there in the toolbar, it says scale X1, Y1, Z1, proportional size 1. Well, I want to scale it just in the X direction, that's all. So I'm going to press X on the keyboard, and you'll see in the toolbar there it says just scale 1 along X, smooth proportional size 1. Now if I just drag the mouse key to the right, you can see I can stretch out my tangentoidal crown curve and make it much longer. So I've just stretched it in the X direction only. And I could have just stretched it in the Z direction as well, that's vertically as we're looking at it, but I want to just stretch it in the X direction. Now to come out of edit mode, I press the tab key on the keyboard. Now whenever you do this in Fluid Designer with a curve, this object is a curve, and we can see that from the icon here in the outliner window. That's telling me that this object's a curve. Whenever you stretch things, always do Control A and just apply the transformation. That's really important in terms of 3D printing. Now you can see what I've done to my curve. Okay, now you will notice if you zoom in that this bit is a bit more, it's got some straight sections here, whereas it was much more rounded when it was shorter. Okay, so you do need to take that into account with what we're doing here, but what you'll notice now is that I'm not going to have to do a count of 20 something to go around here. 4. In fact, if I adjust the relative offset, I could probably do this with a count of 4. There you are, you see. So I've completely transformed my bracelet now. I've got the same sort of pattern, this tangentoidal crown pattern, but instead of having 20 some copies of it, I've only got 4 copies of it. Now in terms of 3D printing, I think I've said a couple of times already, the bigger this count and the bigger this count, the bigger you replicate the original default curve, and the more it's overlapping, the more likely you are to come across a problem in terms of the object, final object might not print. This did print, not a problem. It is all about what the offset is, and it's about the geometry of the shape. But so you can go and reduce the count quite dramatically, and of course, you know, you're changing the style and appearance of the bracelet. And we could, of course, put in an extra row there, or even an extra 2 rows, and so you can transform and personalize the bracelet like that. So I stretched it, scaled it in the X direction. We could, of course, have scaled it in the Z direction, but the count would have still been 22 if we'd have just scaled it in the Z direction. So I'll switch that down to, I think I prefer it as 1. So when you've got a bracelet that you're happy with, Remember, don't go to File and Save, go to Export, export it as a wavefront object to the desktop. I've already got object number 1, copy number 1, so I'm going to just change that to 002 and export that, and that should export quite a bit quicker, as you notice there, because there's only 4 copies of that original pattern. Okay, so that's tangential crown curve bracelet, and as I've said, many of these objects here, not all of them, but many of these objects here, you can perform similar sorts of actions by using scale to change the default curve. Okay, so that's the end of this video. Thank you.